Happy Tuesday.
Greetings. Greetings. It's one of those days. Everything's all over the place, right?
Yes, it is.
So today we are going to jump into the topic of how you use your qualitative and quantitative data to create powerful narratives or stories. And this is a continuation of last week's topic.
Yeah.
So, as we think about the data that we collect, one of the things we talked about last time was the opportunity to use that data not only to report out insights and actions and that sort of thing, but to also craft stories.
Yeah.
And this is really, to me, something that's an important topic right now because we have to figure out ways to make what we do more consumable across the enterprise, across the organization. Okay. So when you think about those qualitative and quantitative inputs, such as your journey maps, how do you develop story kind of storylines from those journey maps, or looking at those quantitative metrics and statistics? How do you use those to weave into your story to help make it more compelling or more impactful? And then when you look at your interview data, we do this, I think, quite often, is to use those quotes, personal anecdotes as ways to pepper in interesting aspects of the customer, their needs, that sort of thing. And then how we can use personas to supplement the story to make it something that is tied to a particular persona within your different segments or different characteristics of those personas and what that story means to them.
Yes. And I think an important point is if you don't have any of this data, then you can't tell your story. So you need to go get this data. So, you hear a lot of people, they just tell their story. And it's their story, or their product story and not kind of the storytelling from the human's perspective, the user in that. And I think your newsletter said it best. It's not your product or service that needs to be the hero. Part of what storytelling brings out is you're supplementing, you're making that user the hero, right? So if you don't have that data, all those things you just mentioned are how you go out and start understanding how you tell that story, how you can even get that data to be able to tell a valid story, an engaging story.
I like two things that you said that they like have me excited. So your story is not about your product. It is from the lens of the person who is interacting with your product.
Yep.
Or you can flip stories around. You can have the story of your user, but then you can have the story of the person who's impacted by that product use. So it might be in a B2B to C scenario. You might have it from that business user or from their customer or consumer.
Yeah.
So that's a really, really key point, is that your story is not about your product. And I love that you mentioned the fact that you're not the hero in the story. Your hero is your user or your customer, and you want to illustrate how your product helps to elevate them, their decision making, their output, their efforts, whatever that might be. Your product is augmenting or supplementing what they're doing to make them more effective.
Right. And keep in mind your product, there's still the story from a user perspective, their journey, their day-to-day life, whatever it is they're trying to accomplish. Part of telling the story is understanding, that helps inform your requirements, your priorities, innovation in a more meaningful way because it's now based on a day in the life, right, of someone. And your product fits in with the story. It's just you keep that focus so you can understand when
Yeah.
you make changes, when you're doing roadmaps, what's that story? What are you impacting in that story? How are you helping that user be that hero in that story with your product or service? So
Yes.
I
Yeah.
think they're really useful for that because a lot of times when you're going to deliver those findings, and you want to do it in an engaging way,
Hmm.
you haven't made that user a hero yet. They're just plugging along, but
Hmm.
their story it may be telling the pain points in a way that people can kind of grasp, if that makes
Hmm. Oh yeah, and I think as you think about the journey, you don't have to go through this tremendous or exhaustive, expensive exercise in journey mapping. You may have, an articulation of that journey or the ability to capture that journey from some of your customers that allows you to then think about where do we have opportunities to either put our focus or to look at other opportunities within that journey. And so you can pull those out of that journey map to then allow you to say, okay, this is how we're going to frame this story.
sense. Hmm.
And then when you think about that quantitative data, you now have the opportunity to use data that might be coming from log or support or analytics. And you may be able to use that data to then sprinkle into your story how much of a pain your customer
Yes.
currently experiences in just general, in general, or with your product. You now have the opportunity to put in there details that help to give the story more life in terms of that empathy and emotion.
Yes, it does. It gives it a lot more life, especially when you're talking to your product teams who, again, I know I said it last week, who just don't want to look at slide after slide, with numbers and priorities in terms of usability issues. Tell what that means.
Mhm.
Let them grab hold of that. So any solutions you're thinking about, plug it into that story. And again, I know I talked about last week. Does it change the story in a good way, right? Does the user
Right.
start feeling more like the hero in the story? So,
Right. And I can recall working on a project for a client where during the customer interviews, and these weren't their customers, these were just interviews for around people that we recruited. There was a couple of interviews where the people talked about their decision to have an elective surgery.
mhm.
And in that elective surgery for their health, in that process, they had to determine how am I going to pay for this? And so, in both instances, they described how they had to use either savings or their 401k to help to pay for these surgeries. And that to me was a very, very compelling, scenario around having to make a really tough decision that's going to impact you not just in the moment, but for the long term from a health standpoint, but also a financial standpoint. And so, having the opportunity to weave in, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that specific scenario, but weaving in
Mhm.
decisions that people have to make that are impactful to various aspects of their lives, that are things that you and I can look at and say, wow, that's a big hard decision that someone had to make. That for me was a good story to tell the client about how can you create features or capabilities within your application that will help people make better decisions
Mhm.
because these are tough decisions. How do you help them, or how do you serve up information that allows them to figure out, is this the right decision for me to make, or is there another option?
Right, right. And how do you represent that in a way that gives people the opportunity to have actionable solutions coming out of all the research?
Absolutely, absolutely. And so when we think about those interviews that you're having with customers and the opportunity to, use their stories, of course, you don't want to just put, everything out there exactly as it is or as it was, but you want to use details and use those as inspiration for the type of information that you can share that
Yeah.
helps to bring that journey kind of into a place where the consumer of that journey can understand, okay, if I'm on a sales or account management team, when I'm talking to clients, I need to be able to play back for them an example or a story. And this is a lot of what, helps to bring things home with a prospect,
Yeah.
especially, is telling a story of a different client and their experience and how it's similar to
Yeah.
that prospect's experience so they can connect the dots. And so when you think about giving detail or life to that story, it makes it so much easier for your sales, your marketing, your product team to figure out, okay, where do we fit within that customer's ecosystem?
Yeah. And like you mentioned, it's not one-offs, right? You're not, oh, I did 20 interviews. I had 20 stories for you. That's not the point, in my opinion, and I think it's the correct one. That's not the point of storytelling from that kind of product or services, solutioning. It's all about taking, synthesizing that data, going back to personas. You may have multiple personas, which means you'll have probably multiple stories to reflect each of those. But yeah, I think it is important I've seen too many instances where you do have one or two interviews and there's your story and people run with it. But that is the whole point of storytelling, is being able to take lots of data, and it makes you a little more deliberate in looking for trends, or just synthesizing all of that and trying to make sense of it. And sometimes the story will help you do that, because I just wanted to revisit that, because I think a lot of people can be guilty of taking one usability session, one or two interviews, and making that their story or their journey, whatever it may be. And a good point is that it's going to make you a little more deliberate on synthesizing that data in a way that people can understand, and you're looking at those trends to tell a story that's not a one-off.
Right, right. I think about it in terms of when my mother taught me how to quilt when I was a kid, and you had all those disparate pieces, but you put them together in a pattern to tell a story through your
And tell
quilt.
the story.
But those pieces were very different, and the way you assembled them was not the way they started. And so you had to make sense out of them in terms of the
Right.
patterns. And so you look for those patterns, like you're saying, and not just one offs.
Yeah.
And that is something that, you want to be cautious around, because in instances like where we've seen our product manager bring that story to the team, and then the team is consuming that story to figure out, okay, what do we, now that we have this story, what do we do in terms of kind of, I think about things from the marketing perspective, or I look at things from the development perspective. Now that I have this story, everyone's got the same context
Yes.
and they're on the same page. But now it also brings life to new ideas, in terms of, implementation within those different functions. It brings new ways in which you present information or have someone interact with things. So I definitely think that, being able to ensure that your story is comprehensive enough
Yes.
is key.
Yes. And same thing with your personas. I think personas are a great asset and input, into these stories. And this is what personas should be about. I know you and I have
Yes.
this conversation all the time, where I'm like, don't do a persona just for persona's sake. Personas they're a means of communicating, but they're also a means of, understanding that the characteristics of your user, making him or her, whoever, relevant and human. So I know you and I can have this conversation all the time about personas. I don't want to do a persona just to do a persona. Same thing with storytelling. Don't tell a story just to tell a story. Make sure that story is representing that segment, and that persona. So they are a great input into stories. So I got sidetracked, because I know I can kind of be bad about, no, I'm not just going to do a persona.
And I think that that's a great point, because there have been several times where I've told a client, we don't do personas unless there is a plan around consumption, keeping them current, and that, someone's going to own them rather, in terms of updating and that sort of thing. We're fine with doing that. but every couple of years, every couple of, whatever transitions you're making in your products, you've got to think about going back and revisiting those personas. And so personas coupled with stories are a good way, especially when you have a product or service that's impactful to different people in different ways. You now have a way to kind of, and I think of, again, I'm thinking of like Lego movies and Willy Wonka, where there's like some sort of action playing out, and you have all the different characters and their personas and how they all have a goal in mind in terms of that action, but that one of them is the guide, one of them is the hero. They have a dilemma. They're trying to figure out what tools they can use to solve that dilemma. So that's where your personas can come in to play, is that you can think about how they work together with your product or service to get to success.
Yes. And like personas, stories have to be kept up to date as well. I mean, I think of AI, how many stories has that changed? From a user perspective, with the way things move so quickly, there's so many new services, products, technologies, people, those stories have to be updated and kept fresh as well as things change in the world, change in the technology space, change in your organization, right? Your products and services. So another good point, Kenya.
That's a great point around AI.
Yeah.
That's a great point around AI, and that if you do have stories that are in circulation in your organization, it's time to revisit them.
Yeah.
Look, and that might start with going back and looking at your customer's journey differently, and where can AI play in their journey and their processes, and what does that mean in terms of the story you now tell around the dilemmas or challenges that they have, and how your product or service can come in and solve one of those pain points or an opportunity.
Yes. Yeah.
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 Awesome.
How does AI play into it, but also in their workflows and that journey, how are they using it that doesn't involve your product and service anymore? So all of those things kind of come out in those stories. One of my favorite is with the going back to office management software and invoicing. And so it took getting out there and being able to go to several sites and see what is that story, what is going on. All right, we knocked out the invoices. We have beautiful invoices, but the real story was there was a whole lot of crazy stuff going on, Yes, day in the life, you've got clients coming in, you've got meetings or court dates or whatever it may be scheduled. You've got office staff trying to get things together. They need to generate invoices. Well, that was just part of the story. Before that piece of it was this office staff, and this is one of my favorite stories because I witnessed it, and it was like, we're not telling the story right. They're not just generating invoices. You've got admins running around like chickens, high stress, trying to catch up with this busy partner and get all this time. So it became more than about the invoice. It became about, that story was they need to keep up with their time so they can generate the invoices. And that turned out to be the big pain point in that story. So, get out there. And the big thing is, if you don't have this data to tell what you feel is a valid, solid story, we've named several methods you use right now to start generating that data. If you I guarantee you probably have some data somewhere, but if you don't, get out there on those site visits, get in those interviews, do your usability testing, get those journey maps up where everyone's on the same page about how do we take this and make a story. So there are a lot of methods you can use to go out there and start getting the inputs into your stories, and then going out and validating and tweaking those stories as things change, as you learn more. They just constantly evolve.
Yeah, yeah, I think you said it. You summed it up well. So it's get out of. It's essentially about getting out of the building.
Yeah, get out of
Um,
the building.
just like when you do your you do your spring cleaning to purge, but then you recognize the things that you need to replace.
Yeah.
The rest of the year, I think we're doing the same thing. So, well, thank you so much for listening in today. If you have any questions for us, do not hesitate to reach out. You can reach us at info@leangeeks. And we thank you again for listening in with us, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, fun.